Well, there's some good news for rationalists who were skeptical of mass lockdowns from the beginning of the pandemic. You were right. Turns out bringing society to a grinding halt had minimal impacts on COVID-19 deaths, didn't really prevent them, but they were disastrous for the economy and society. New research from Johns Hopkins, Lund University, and Copenhagen Center for Political Studies showed forcing people out of parks and into confined spaces with sick family members increased mortality by almost 3%. Between shuttered businesses, closed schools, and mask mandates, the mental and emotional toll of COVID-19 lockdowns have been staggering. Some of the measurable elements are downright heartbreaking. 400,000 small businesses have closed for good, while cronyist behemoths like Target and Walmart, they did just fine. 37% of all small businesses couldn't make the rent during the pandemic, and only half of the remaining mom and pop shops are making pre-pandemic revenues. It wasn't just the U.S. suffering the brunt of bureaucratic overreaction. 1.6 billion kids were out of school. 97% of teachers admit their students suffered learning losses. And a report in December from the World Bank and the UN estimates today's kids will suffer $17 trillion in lost future wages because of all this compliance. So what was the study's conclusion? Never, ever again should society be shut down to combat a pandemic. The researchers agreed, writing, such a standard benefit cost calculation leads to a strong conclusion. Lockdown should be rejected out of hand as a pandemic policy instrument. And it wasn't just lost wages and dreams. Domestic violence shot up over 8%, and drug overdoses a tragic 28%. We are now $31.1 trillion in debt, thanks in part to the money flooded into the economy by the Fed and aggressive spending bills. And all this loose money will only exacerbate inflation that topped 7% in December after 7 straight months above 5%. Will the spineless politicians and omnipotent bureaucrats heed the advice of this stark and agnostic research? Absolutely not. These slimy, bottom-feeding bubble dwellers are too addicted to their new power, control, and money. And the most dangerous COVID variant is highly transmissible authoritarianism. And that's the memo. The funny thing is, former President Donald J. Trump actually predicted this mess just a week after much of the country locked down. Remember this?
If it were up to the doctors, they may say, let's keep it shut down. Let's shut down the entire world. And when we shut it down, that would be wonderful. And let's keep it shut for a couple of years. You know, we can't do that. Well, it causes bigger problems than the original. That's why I talk about the cure being worse than the problem.
Deborah Burke's like, oh my God, what am I doing here? Now, I'm not saying that the former president got everything right. He did a lot wrong, but he was right there. And in hindsight, was shutting the world down the biggest mistake we made during the pandemic, aside from trusting China? All right, let's meet tonight's party panel. We've got the Spectator contributing editor and host of the Versus Media podcast, Stephen L. Miller, is back with a glorious skyline behind him. We've got Democrat strategist, radio host, and Fox News contributor Leslie Marshall, luscious Leslie, yes, and comedian and host of the Part of the Problem podcast. He is back. He's ready for action. He is Dave Smith. Welcome one and all, Stephen L. Miller. I will start with you. This is wholly unsurprising, but it is pretty remarkable when you look at the numbers and the suffering that the lockdown caused.
Yeah, I think there's an element to this when this was all happening where a good chunk of people just accepted it and said, you know, well, we've never been through something like this before, so we're just going to be good and we're going to take it and we're going to accept all of this and the rules. And then now, as time has gone on and we found out that, again, the fallout of these has just been extraordinary. And on top of that, we have more and more information that the people who locked us down were not locking down themselves. That includes Boris Johnson in the UK. That includes Deborah Birx, who you just showed, who just kind of faded out of memory. And that just kind of compounds on top of all of this stuff. So I'm willing to cut a little bit of slack because we had never gone through something like this before, but now it's clear that this isn't working. And I think you're right that you do have a certain section of the political aisle who doesn't want to kind of let go of this stuff, despite what the data says.
Yeah, unfortunately, Leslie, I don't trust that this won't happen again because we've never gotten fully satisfying answers about where it started in the first place. So, you know, if you don't know where it came from, you certainly don't know where you're going. And I don't trust the people in charge to listen to research like this. And, you know, these are not MAGA Donald Trump advisors. These are, as I said, pretty agnostic researchers who did the cost-benefit analysis, and the benefits were minimal, the costs were way too much.
Well, President Biden in his last speech said no more lockdowns and schools should not be closed. Obviously, it's not up to the president of the United States, whether you're Democrat or Republican, to make that decision for each school district. And what I think, and I think Stephen, you know, hit on it, which is, you know, we've never been through this before. And I think, honestly, regardless of political party, I think that mayors, I think the president, the former and the current, and governors were just trying to do what is best for their citizens. They were looking at countries that had gone before us with the spread of this virus. South Korea at first appeared to have it more under control with lockdowns. We saw that also in Vietnam, and then we saw other countries like Italy, Spain, Germany, and other allies of ours in the international community do this. So I think that we were, you know, trusting of that. And also because it's brand new, another key word, which you said, Kennedy, is hindsight. Hindsight is 2020. We didn't have the
not always
the ability to have that
if
hindsight.
It were,
at the
we
time.
wouldn't have
so
gotten into the Afghanistan
war. The best
war.
that they could, the medical professionals, the scientists, and the politicians.
All right. So, Dave, not only will they not take this hindsight into account, they're not letting go. Like, we are still very much in the grips of the pandemic authoritarianism. You know, there may not be the formal lockdowns that there were at the very beginning, but is this a free society that we're living in?
Well, certainly not. I mean, we have been living in a totalitarian society since March of 2020, and I honestly don't think there's any other word to describe it. And when you think back about the harshest lockdowns, totalitarianism is the only accurate word. I mean, you actually had Americans watching their television set to find out from their governor what they were allowed to do today, whether they could have a funeral for their father, let's say. I mean, and I just do not buy any of these weak arguments that it's like, well, hindsight is 2020. Well, actually, some of us were right about it before we needed hindsight, and we were out there saying that these lockdowns were going to be disastrous and would do very little, if nothing, to mitigate the virus. And now that we've been proven right, it's like, oh, hindsight is 2020. But at the time, we were labeled kooks and selfish and didn't care about grandma and only wanted to get a haircut, when really what we were standing up for were the tens of millions of people whose lives were ruined. This is going to be at least 4 generations before the damage from this is you know, undone, if ever. And I'm sorry, this is one of the worst, just the lockdowns are one of the worst crimes perpetrated by the government against the American people in my lifetime. The people who made those decisions, I believe, should be removed from office and tried for crimes against humanity. They have no right, they had no right to appoint themselves mini dictators. And at the very least, if you're just saying they got it wrong, they should be nowhere near public policy ever again.
Yeah, and, you know, authoritarianism knows no party. It really doesn't. When you get a little bit of power, guess what? You want a little bit more. And, you know, to your point, the 4 generations of people who will be impacted by this, I was thinking about that. I was reloading our mask drawer today, and I thought it's so weird that this is such a normal part of my daughter's lives, you know, and, you know, your kids as well, as they go out into the world, you know, especially it's cold here in New York City, they put on their coat and their gloves and their mask. And I was thinking to myself, like, what are they going to tell their children? Like, what are they going to tell their kids about living through the pandemic? Because it's so much a part of them right now. I don't even think they have enough perspective to think about that for at least 10 years. They're not the only ones who hate the lockdowns and the masks. Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul, he hates it all too. Earlier today on the Fox News Channel, he slammed policy failures and brought the hammer down on dog killer and lord of lockdowns, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Watch.
There was no correlation between any of the mandates that government put in place and any change in the incidence of the disease. So it was an utter failure, but it's been so politicized that I don't think Dr. Fauci will ever apologize or admit to the country. But we need to have people like him removed from office because they've been so wrong on so much policy.
Get him out. And to Stephen's point, where is Deborah Birx? But that's not all. Senator Paul, also going after some of Fauci's riskier ideas, writing in an opinion piece titled Fauci's Gain-of-Function Conspiracy, and while I'll continue to hold him and his allies accountable. So how long is Fauci going to hold on to power? Obviously, he has the secret to living forever, at least politically, Stephen.
He'll hold on to power until about January 20th at noon 2025 is my guess. He compared this to like World War II. He said, I'm not leaving until, you know, I guess we vanquished every last. And this is what's interesting about Dr. Fauci is he always says in interviews, in friendly interviews, I'd like to see him go on Joe Rogan, for instance. He says in interviews, we're not there yet. Well, we're going to, you know, we still have to do some stuff and we're not there yet. And he will never tell you when there is, in his opinion. And that's because he's been wrong so many times about this kinds of stuff. And I mean, that's kind of his problem, is he's told so many noble lies and he's just lost the public trust. And he should have resigned over a year ago. I was one of the first people to put that in print, saying that. But no, he's gonna stick around as long as, you know, they keep creating vaccines for viruses that they helped engineer, and
yes.
It's this vicious cycle. And he'll be around until kind of his life's work is complete, which might result in all of us dead.
And then still, he'll be the last one alive inside the Utah
I think that's the goal.
Mountain lair. There are so many conflicts of interest here, Leslie, and it shouldn't be politicized. It is black and white. What he's done, what he's known, what he funded, what he obfuscated. And, you know, this is someone who has not been straightforward. There are other virologists in the country. There are other epidemiologists and ones who have been working for a long, long time who aren't nearly as conflicted as Fauci. Your thoughts?
I think, and I'm going to be like Dave. Dave, I'm not going to be able to be here to see in 4 generations if you were right or wrong. Wish I could, you know, to call you out on that if you're wrong. But you said that you guys were right about lockdown. So let's see if I'm going to be right about something. If Anthony Fauci were fired, any epidemiologist or virologist that would replace him would eventually become Fauci too. And the reason I say that is, unless somebody gets up and tells people exactly what they want to hear and exactly is right, almost like, you know, somebody going to Vegas and, you know, hitting the slots or getting 21 in blackjack every time, they're going to be criticized. They're going to be criticized by whatever administration they're in, whether Democrat or Republican, and the American people, because all the American people want to hear is, COVID is gone, and that's what they want to hear. And this is the how-to step-by-step on how to do it. Dr. Fauci, any medical professional or scientist, they're not gods, they're not clairvoyants, they're scientists.
No, according to him, he is science. That's very different than being a scientist. So if you question him at all, Dave, you are questioning science. But there is a lot that he has to answer for, and there are a lot of questions that right now only one person is asking, and that's Rand Paul.
Yeah, and Rand Paul, you know, it's almost every time they have one of these hearings, Rand Paul makes his case. The corporate media just dunks on him and tears him apart. And then about 2-3 weeks later, it comes out that he was completely right. I mean, even with the gain of function, you know, Fauci, who testified under oath that they never funded gain of function, now says they never funded gain of function of concern, which is kind of different than what he said testifying before Congress. But I mean, I'll half agree with Leslie. I think that the type of epidemiologist that's likely to be appointed by a politician would likely be very similar to Fauci. But there are lots of epidemiologists, many of whom have been banned off Twitter and YouTube and stuff like that, who argued against the lockdowns and the mandates and the vaccine passports and all of this from the very beginning. There were a large number of epidemiologists who were pushing that we simply contain those people who are at risk and let the rest of society get on with life, which in hindsight would have been a much, much better thing to do. So I don't think it's true that any epidemiologist, but unfortunately this is the type of scientist that the political system produces. And the idea that Fauci just will not back down or admit when he's gotten things catastrophically wrong, that I think we have every right to criticize him for that, especially when he's committed crimes, namely perjury.
He absolutely has perjured himself, and you can't change the definition of something just to wiggle out of a lie. Our panel is going to stick around. We got much more, and coming up, an explosive lawsuit now claiming systemic racism is rife within the NFL, and it's a recently fired Miami Dolphins head coach making those claims. Does he have a case? Plus, CNN honcho Jeff Zucker suddenly resigning in disgrace. Oh, look at that face. So handsome. Is it the revenge of Chris Cuomo? And what does it mean for the liberal news network of the libs? They're having a hard time. It's all coming up.